I think we could get started. Let me quickly introduce our speaker today, and we will be learning about his research on crowdsourcing. So Dr. Matthew Lees is a professor at UT Austin. His research is in crowdsourcing and data annotation and data quality. He has done very interesting research in this area and has received the Best Paper Award at AAAI 2016. His research not only contributed to academia, but also to industry. He basically, to Amazon Mechanical Turk, Crowdflower, which is another leading kind of company in this area. And more importantly, I think to the Text Retrieval Conference, TREC. Matt, thank you very much for giving us the opportunity, and please take it away.
Great. Thanks so much for having me here. So let's see. So I'm briefly planning to talk about two topics today. They're somewhat disjoint, but both in this space of human computation and crowdsourcing. So one around content moderation, which is more of HCI work, and one about supporting complex annotations, which is more about sort of machine learning work. And so in general, my work kind of spans those two areas both. So the order of the talk will be talking about those two things, and I'll talk after the first part to take any questions people have. And then before I get started, I was going to give just two little bits of context first. So lots of people are thinking about responsible AI right now. So UT Austin is included. So we have sort of a grand challenge initiative across the entire university where we are trying to think about responsible AI technologies from a multidisciplinary perspective. So I'm one of the faculty leading that, and that sort of pervades my work. So I won't be talking too much about fairness or explainability today, which is something that I'm working in. But we will hear for the first case where we're talking about sort of the good aspects of the technology we're trying to develop for society. The other thing quickly say is I'm a computer scientist, I probably like all of you, but I'm working in one of these information schools, which I'd never heard of until I went on the job market and wanted to have a job like everyone else does probably. And so these information schools, if you aren't familiar with them, they are sort of a blend of social science and computer science. So they're friendly to people like me who want to do a mix of HCI and machine learning, as well as they're just very interdisciplinary. So you get a lot of different perspectives for looking at sort of problems that fall across traditional gaps. So when you're thinking of advising undergraduates for graduate studies or sending your PhD students on the job market, please have them take a look at information schools as well, because a lot of interesting stuff is happening there. Okay, so starting the first part of the talk on content moderation. So content moderation is something that's super important today on platforms like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. There's tons of user-generated content, which sort of is enabling us to connect and share information with each other more than ever before. But the problem is, of course, some of these kinds of content are unacceptable. And that could be for issues of what the platform itself allows. It could be for issues of what the state or local region that the platform operating is in allows. A lot of times, these things can range from minor things like violating copyright to more extreme things like violence or adult content. And often the determinations are quite subjective and vary from platform to platform about what is or is not sort of acceptable content. And so a lot of the work or debate you hear talking about right now on content moderation is really about free speech issues. Sort of when do people have the right to post something and when do they do not? That's not what this talk is about. This talk is going to be about the issues of the people behind the scenes who are doing this moderation work and the sort of the impact it has on them. And so a nice paper, if you just want to have one sort of reading broadly about sort of the space, is Facebook has this nice paper they put out in September looking at these issues of integrity in social networks online. But so if you just look at like the scale of content that's getting removed online, here's some quick statistics from YouTube and Facebook. You can see, massive amounts of content are getting removed. And certainly they'll try to remove as much of this as they can automatically, and sometimes they can do that. But a lot of it ends up relying on human moderators to do part of this work. So why can't we just automate this all? Well, partly there's a very high cost of errors. So for instance, if you consider a very violent image that you might not want your child to see online, what's the cost if they automatically make a mistake and let that show through? So it's a sense that really they can't make errors, in some sense. It's much better, or at least the cost of errors is very asymmetric. It's much better to block something than to potentially let it through. There's continually evolving content and moderation policies. So the platforms might want to allow something different. Also, people are constantly posting new stuff, and that can be benign or it can be actually adversarial. So if you're trying to get something posted and it's getting blocked, how can you massage it a little bit to get it across there? There's sort of a little bit of adversarial stuff back and forth also between the content generators and the platforms. So worldwide today, there's something like 100,000 paid content moderators, not counting all the volunteer moderators that work on many platforms. So something like, say, 15,000 for Facebook or for YouTube. A point I guess it's worth mentioning is when I say, Facebook or YouTube, almost none of these people actually work for the social media companies. They're almost always contracted out to contracting services, which sort of provides sort of a level of separation from the companies and some of the issues associated with content moderation. And that sometimes is challenging in terms of the sort of support provided to the workers in doing this work. Another really important thing to remember is that even when we have machine learning models, often these come from annotated data that's used to train and test these models. And the annotations have to come from somewhere. So if you're on a platform where maybe this is already happening, you already have human moderation happening, ideally you can recycle those human judgments back into annotations for training and testing tools. But a lot of new people who are getting into the space, they're a new company, a new startup, or new kinds of content, they're actually going and collecting additional human annotations to try to train these models. And a point I would make is for anybody who's interested in doing, machine learning or data collection in this space, even if we have human annotators labeling this data, the same kinds of concerns that I'm talking about today for people who are doing this in practice for moderation on the platforms, we have the same kind of issues for the people that we're paying to annotate data for us to train our machine learning models. So I first became this issue, I guess, almost 10 years ago, when some articles were coming out about things like people when their job is looking at beheadings on Facebook, and trying to filter that kind of violent content out from getting into your news feed, and just the real challenge of exposure effects from viewing this. And so this has started really getting a lot more attention in the past several years. Sarah Roberts has a nice book that I'll show at the very end of the talk. There is a increasing recognition across popular media and starting now in scholarly reporting around potential mental health issues like PTSD from being repeatedly exposed to this kind of content, along with other sort of stressful job conditions. So Casey Newton has done a lot of the really great reporting in this space, has a lot of articles. And as I was sort of mentioning there, if you run one of these moderation centers like a call center where there's high pressure and quotas that have to be maintained, then people are having to deal with additional job stressors like that on top of exposure effects of dealing with the content as well. So, so in human computation, we have this really great, exciting notion that when we want to build applications, we're no longer limited by the state of the art of AI. So let's say you want to build something that you need to have 90% classification accuracy, and state-of-the-art machine learning only gets 85. You can go out now behind the scene and have a human in the loop doing part of the work, and suddenly you're no longer bound by sort of, again, the top accuracy your machine learning model can get. So suddenly we have this great opportunity, through the internet, through online connectivity, to have people doing all of this great work behind the scenes to let us deliver more innovative and powerful applications than we ever have before. The problem in this case is this is because the algorithms aren't good enough, we're relying on people to do this. And this is actually the last thing you want people doing. This is the kind of work you actually really want the algorithm doing, because an algorithm won't have sort of the same kind of psychological exposure effects from viewing this content. So I tried to get some students interested in this for a while. And eventually I had these two great students, Brandon and Martin, who ran with this idea for a little bit, where we were looking particularly at imagery. And so the research question that we investigated in this work with them was, could we sort of reduce exposure? Could we reveal less of an image and therefore reduce the amount of psychological exposure you would have to the content without reducing the speed or efficiency with which moderators could do this work? Another way, just sort of by analogy to think about is, there's been various studies around people who work in the sex trade, and we might have various moralistic judgments about people who do this work. But regardless of that, how can you support people who choose to do this kind of work to enable them to do it sort of as safely as possible? So we had this demo we came up with in terms of an interface design, and this is live online, and I'll show you a demo of it right now. Let's see, switch to my browser. Okay, so here is some image, and you can see it starts out very blurred. So one thing you could do is you can reveal parts of it by clicking. So if I click somewhere, I'll see just that part of the image. That spot I click will persist, and maybe by just clicking those minimum amounts, I can choose what's okay or what's not okay to post. Another form of this is sort of a mouse over. So you can see as I move my mouse cursor around, I just temporarily unblur part of it and then make it go away again. A third modality we had was this sort of slider. So down at the bottom of the screen, I have an interaction for how much I want to blur the image, and I can change the overall blur of the entire image by moving sort of this slider around. So we did this first work in 2018 at HComp, but we never actually had the evaluation of it for various uninteresting reasons due to logistics. And so that work just sort of sat out there for a little bit. Starting around 2019, we actually started, though, to see this kind of uptake in the platforms. So in May of 2019, there was starting to get popular reporting about Facebook having an interface like this, where the moderators could blur the images, show them in black and white, potentially mute videos, so they didn't have to hear some of this kind of content. And one of the things we started here also, from the psychologists was beyond the actual controls for reducing exposure, just simply giving people controls for controlling some bit of how they experience the content was itself something that kind of enabled people to deal with it better. This is a quote from Chris Harrison, who's really one of the leading figures from the mental health side at Facebook, who talks about that we just don't know, though, ultimately at the end of the day, like how much exposure is too much, for the people doing this work. And the challenge the platforms really struggle with, again, as another quote here from Facebook, is that they're dealing with sort of, again, very high volume of stuff they have to maintain. How do they do this while still kind of taking care of the workers who have to do the work? There's some regions of the world that, for instance, if you have objectionable content up, you're fined by the hour, that it's up. So they're under high pressure to get this stuff off quickly. So industry, as you started to see, are starting to move towards, I think, some bit of best practices in this space, although there still isn't a lot of study yet. So for instance, here's again from Microsoft a year ago, an interface where you can see in the top left, they have some of these controls for, say, shifting a video to black and white or doing this kind of blurring. But really, we don't have much in the way of studies about understanding how this stuff actually helps or if it doesn't. So in HComp 2019, a couple of Google researchers published the first study we know of where they looked again at, grayscaling as well as blurring. And they basically followed the same design that we had proposed, but we never got around to doing it in 2018. But they did it with real moderators as part of the Google queue, which was great. And so they did find some benefit there. Particularly though, with the kind of blurring they looked at, they only considered a static blur, and it seemed to give the annotators headache. So the work I'm going to be talking about in just a minute is we sort of have this interactive blurring of the form I just showed you in the demo. So at left here is my PhD student, Anna Brodo, who came along and helped me finally get this work evaluated and done out there. So we published this at HComp this past fall. So you've seen the demo already. So this is the study to actually see how much it helps. So we gave people content that might be violent or adult. We gave them sort of cartoon versus real imagery. And we gave them the simple question, would you approve this content being posted on Facebook or not? In practice, these moderation guidelines for different platforms can be hundreds of pages, extremely detailed. And so getting into all that, of course, is a whole other challenge. So we just made this a sort of very simple and somewhat subjective question for our participants. And we ran this study on Mechanical Turk. So we asked them these questions about whether it should be posted or not. But we also, the big thing is we combine this with a psychological panel. And so we asked them on this positive negative experience scale about the Spain scale, the extent to which they had these positive or negative feelings. We measured another scale, PANIS, for affect. We measured emotional exhaustion. And we measured things like usefulness. So I'll say more in just a minute, kind of connecting all this. So we have some image data set here. Again, I think I've said a bit about graphic, adult, different kinds of things. I think these are just sort of uninteresting details in the Mechanical Turk study. But main points to say is we want to measure performance things. So, if we're going to do an intervention on a platform, we can't screw up their accuracy and we can't slow them down, because if they do, the platforms won't really consider it, basically. We have to have an intervention that comes in and hopefully helps them deal with the work better, but doesn't actually impact performance measures. So we're going to measure these two things, like these performance measures and these well-being measures. So here's the good thing on performance is we don't screw things up. So on the bottom of the slide, we see, for instance, our control group, which does no intervention. We look at this total blur over the whole thing at different levels of how much blur. So, a Gaussian noise blur, which is a little bigger or a little bit less. And then we had these 3 different interventions where they're actually interactive. So the slider at the bottom of the thing where we can make it more or less blurred overall, this click interface, or the hover, which is the mouse movement where I just moved around and it partially unblurred. And on the y-axis here, we're measuring accuracy, and we see these sort of box plots. And you can see here's in the control group about how accurate people were when they just sort of saw the whole image. And what we see, for instance, if you look at, say, our click and our hover designs, is we're basically in the same place. I mean, hover in particular is almost the same as the control. In terms of the time that people take, similarly, you can see our control group, about the box plot spread here, a little above a second. And similarly, again, if you look at our 3 designs, they're sort of in the same space. So good first thing is, even though we have these interactive designs where people have to do something to a little bit to unblur, we're actually not seeing differences in accuracy or time overall. I didn't say it, but we have their task interfaces really instrumented. So we measure everything from clicks and mouse movements, and we know kind of at a very fine granularity what they're actually doing with the content as they move it, as they sort of make these judgments. So I'm going to try to trim down the results we have in the paper to be sort of pretty succinct, but we measured a couple different things about just, first of all, do annotators find this interface useful or not on kind of the different ways. And you can see that, again, in terms of the control group, the slider is slightly more useful. Some of these other interactive ones are slightly less useful. In terms of perceived ease of use, the hover and the slider are both sort of equal to the control. So at least in terms of these measures, we're kind of in the right ballpark. But I think this is the main one I think I'm going to show in terms of just sort of the emotional affect, kind of cutting again a bunch of the results for time purposes. So we ask questions like, I would feel emotionally drained from this work, or I would dread getting up in the morning. So asking sort of the questions about sort of how emotionally exhausted people would find this work. And we measure that for sort of these different designs. And you see here our control is around 40 or 30s, depending on what the question was. And you can see in particular, like this hover design is the one that we kind of most clearly see really different answers to the questions we're getting from people. And so this is near my last slide for this first part of the talk on the content moderation stuff. So again, we measured these things about operational performance, like speed and accuracy, and then sort of psychological well-being with a whole bunch of questions. We have these 3 different interactive designs, and then try to sort of see what was the best among them. And, things are always slightly a bit of a mixed bag, but overall, like this hover design showed up probably the most consistently as the thing that seemed to be causing sort of the best improvement towards emotional well-being, while sort of none of them really impacted the time or accuracy that much. So our overall recommendation based on this is that one could look at doing this hover design have minimal impact on speed and accuracy and have some potential benefit on the well-being of the workers. So quickly wrap up again this first part of the talk. We have that evaluation that really went through and kind of measured this. There, again, other than the Google study, we really don't know of any other studies like this, partly because, dealing with violent and adult content is not the most pleasant thing. So I think a lot of people wouldn't want to do this research. It also is more difficult in terms of the IRB study, IRB controls you have to do to really take care of the participants in the study. And then there's other issues, but it's the kind of thing that, again, it's a little bit harder to study sometimes as an academic versus maybe the companies. So the quick thing to say is I've collaborated since then with some folks at TaskUs who are psychologists working with the content moderators in the actual workforce. And we have this literature review that'll be at CHI this year that I think is a really deep study. It took us a long time to really get through everything for this. And so I think it'll be a great read. It's posted online now if you want to learn more kind of about this space. And some more popular things that you might be interested in reading. There is a documentary called The Cleaners, which is a fun but informative thing about some of the people doing this work. Sarah Roberts has this great book, Behind the Screen, that kind of brought a lot of attention to this. And there's another book here by Tarleton Gillespie. So with that, I think I want to stop and see if there's any questions on this part of the talk before I shift to the next topic.
Sure. So if you have any question, please unmute yourself and ask the question, or you can write it in the chat. All right, let me ask a quick question, Matt. I wonder if it is useful to measure the optimal amount of, given an image, given an input image, to which extent it should be blurred so that it is like, as close as to the original image. So we don't have any, we are not kind of, imposing the annotator to use any of these kind of tools that we are giving to him. So for imagine for every given image, we could kind of come up with an estimate of the blurriness and then blur to that extent and show it to the annotator. Would that be something useful?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so this first study we've done is totally just an HCI approach. There's no intelligence really in it other than some tools that people can play with. So certainly what you'd like to do is figure out intelligently, for instance, how much to blur, or you might even blur different parts of the image if you could just automatically detect those. There's also been some work you could do stylistic transformations of parts of the image. So for instance, one of the things the Google people said, for instance, would be doing like a deep dream transform of the image to put it from a real context to a more stylistic context, or changing the color of blood from red to green or something else like this. So in that CHI paper I mentioned a second ago, we have a whole section on proposed future work that we would love to see others do in this space, where, yeah, I think there's interesting things to try to think about approaches that absolutely combine machine learning and computer vision along with HCI together, so that we can sort of have more of a soft touch and do more intelligent things rather than, yeah, this is a little bit brute force that we just blur the whole thing right now.
So, and in terms of annotations, annotators, I think there are two types of annotators. Some of them are kind of really, concentrating on the task and try to do their best, and some of them are just there to quickly click on something and go move on to the next one. So we have this test data for quality assurance, of course, but do you think this kind of tool that you're introducing somehow affect the quality of the work that especially for the second group of people who may kind of say, okay, because of this tool I'm not doing very well, or things like this that and so basically oftentimes you say I did this annotation because this tool is is blurring the image or is misleading me to some extent. Would you think that would be something that is acceptable for the second group of annotators who are not doing their job very well?
Yeah, so I would say the number one concern people have with crowdsourcing in general is data quality issues. And so that's what you see, lots of papers being written around, and certainly I've done stuff in this space. I think with this kind of study here, there are a lot of different pieces that make it a little bit less interesting and harder for it to be sort of done in this way, which is less attentive by the workers, between sort of the survey design, the interactive tool. There's also a bit about, people can choose different tasks to work on. This is one that's not only restricted to adults, but there's whole informed consent, about the kinds of stuff you'll be looking at. So in general, I think there's a pretty rich community of workers doing behavioral studies on Mechanical Turk who are actually pretty invested in the work, and a lot of good study designs around it. So quality issues are certainly something you always have to think about. If I were just going to leave, one message though, I think the community is much too fast to blame the workers and too slow to look at our own culpability in how we design tasks, in terms of having clear instructions, examples of what we want, interfaces that actually work, responsible pay for the workers, and things of that regard. So yeah, I certainly could talk more about quality issues, but it wasn't something we really had in this study, or really germane to today's talk too much.
All right, thanks. So if do we have any other questions?
If not, no problem. I'll just jump on to the next
Yeah,
part.
all right.
Okay, so the second work I was going to be talking about today, so this is on crowdsourcing as well, more on the machine learning side. This is joint work with my PhD student, Alex, who's on the call here too. So at the end, if I fail in any of your great questions, he can help dig me out. And so this is work on modeling and aggregation of complex annotations. So when we want to train or test a machine learning model, it's very common that we collect human annotations. So for example, on a simple classification task, we might collect labels about whether text has positive or negative sentiment. Or we might collect labels, say for ImageNet, about the category an image belongs to. Or in rating tasks, we might ask people, is this a high quality product? Or how relevant is a given web page to a search query? So when we collect annotations like this, one very common practice is to ask multiple people to label the same item. And so sort of just as Hadi was mentioning, in the context of crowdsourcing, I might have concerns about quality and inexpert annotators. And so if I get multiple people to label it and then reason about the best label from their group, I might have a better confidence of label quality. We also have this though in settings with traditional or trusted annotators, where for instance, in medical diagnosis, I might want the wisdom of crowds of having multiple experts look at a case, or multiple diverse opinions. So for instance, in hate speech annotation, we know that people from different linguistic groups are going to be more or less likely to annotate in a tweet as hate or not. So you might want to have diversity in that respect in terms of demographics or language or something. So in general, in this aggregation, the task as it's typically defined is given a set of labels for a given item. We want to select the best label that we're going to use as the consensus or gold label or ground truth label for the item. There is a little bit of work in terms of merging labels or fusing labels, and I can talk more about that in QA, but for purposes of this talk, we're just talking about selecting the best label from the set of what's available. So here's a simple example. Imagine I ask 3 people what the capital of Austin or capital of Texas is, and 2 people say Austin and 1 person says Houston. So the simple thing I can do here is a strategy known as majority voting. I just let everyone vote. In this case, I have 2 votes for Austin, and so I pick that as the best answer. Now, in this simple majority voting, I just assume everyone is equally capable or accurate. A lot of work looks at trying to estimate reliabilities of different annotators. And so I might do a weighted voting where I would give more weight to one person versus another person. But all this work in this space, in terms of kind of general aggregation model, rests on this basic idea that we can see that when people agree on some answer, we're going to select that and maybe give it some more weight to people who seem to be more trustworthy. But what happens if I have a task like image captioning? So I say, caption this image, and I ask 3 people, and all 3 people write something completely different, right? The label space is very large. And so when you have a small set of annotators, it's unlikely that the annotators will ever agree on a single answer. So there won't be any majority. And essentially all these techniques that rely on exact match, on annotators landing on the same answer, all fail. And this isn't just image captioning. So if we think about tasks like asking people to come up with a ranked list, what are the top 10 US imports? Or in linguistics, syntactic parsing, ask people to come up with a syntax tree underlying a sentence. Or in information extraction, asking people to annotate spans in text that correspond to some information we want to pull out. These are sort of all cases where the label space is really large and this sort of traditional body of techniques don't work. So let me just say a little more about that. So in human computation and crowdsourcing, the #1 studied problem is this aggregation. There are literally hundreds of papers, more models than you ever want to look at. I did benchmarking in this space maybe 8 years ago, and I sort of considered the problem solved. I was tired of seeing papers and it felt like people were beating a dead horse. But what we sort of came to realize recently in my work with Alex was that essentially these models don't apply to annotation tasks other than simple classification or rating kinds of things. So there's lots of great models, but they just sort of don't handle more interesting annotation tasks. And as we start to think about machine learning models trying to do more and more complex things, like these models fall short. Now, there certainly are models for more complex annotation tasks, but they're not general. So what happens is when people have some kind of more complex task like sequence annotation, they'll come up with some kind of custom bespoke model for handling that particular annotation task. And that's great, particularly if you want to write a paper on every new kind of task that comes out, but it's not very good if you're, say, a crowdsourcing platform and you're trying to provide quality assurance for lots of different kinds of tasks, and you have to engineer, build, and maintain a new model for every task of interest. And these things are, hard to come up with and take time. So that's the approach sort of the machine learning community has taken, to sort of coming up with these probabilistic models. In the HCI community, their approach, on the other hand, is workflows. So let's say, for instance, I have a task if I want to know in this given picture of a dinner plate, how many calories the dinner is going to be. So what I might do is break this up into small subtasks. So in one task, people draw bounding boxes around each kind of food, and then they label what kind of food is in each box. And then they give a quantity of how much of that food, is inside that thing. So you can break this complex task down into smaller ones and then have people do each of these. But trying to come up again with these workflows for every different task of interest is a huge endeavor. So as Hadi mentioned in my introduction, I worked at Crowdflower, one of these crowdsourcing platforms, once upon a time. And when we were doing this for customers, it amazed me. A third of the company was basically doing workflow design, which was just sort of incredible. So again, this stuff can work, but it takes a lot of effort. And in general, these two approaches of sort of the bespoke probabilistic model or the custom workflows are sort of complementary. So what we'd like is an aggregation model that can support these kinds of complex tasks, building from this very rich literature we have on Bayesian models for simple annotation tasks, but something that generalizes across complex annotation tasks. So the idea is can we somehow reduce these annotations to some simpler common space? So the idea we have here is to do a partial credit matching based on a task-specific distance function. So the only thing we want to know about the specific task is how far apart 2 annotations in it are. Give us a distance function to say how far apart 2 image captions are, or how far apart 2 rankings are. Given that distance function, we can take any set of annotations and change the task from modeling annotations to modeling annotation distances. Now, this distance function also is not something you actually have to come up with, because they basically already exist. So let's say you're doing syntactic parsing as a task you're working on. There's a gold standard and your model produces a syntactic parse, and you have to evaluate how well your model's prediction matches the gold standard. That's a distance function, effectively. And to the extent to which these evaluation metrics, well, let me just jump ahead. So, distance functions have certain properties that have to be satisfied, non-negativity, symmetry, triangle inequality. Not all evaluation metrics satisfy all of these properties, but it seems like they can typically be adapted pretty easily to do so. So for example, in machine translation, blue is one of these metrics for um, looking at, say, the quality of a machine translation versus a gold standard translation. And this is not symmetric, but you can easily come up with sort of a symmetric variant of it. So the idea is that in these different annotation tasks we're interested, we already have evaluation functions. So since we have evaluation functions, we already have distance functions, and that's all we need to sort of reduce things to a common space. So as pre-processing, we'll take, say, these 4 image captions, and we're going to compute the distance between all pairs of them using our distance function. And what we might find is these 3 that are most similar are pretty close to one another, whereas the one that's most different is far away. And so now we have, after pre-processing, this distance matrix, and that's all we're going to operate on in terms of the actual aggregation model. So for all 4 of these different tasks, they basically all get mapped down to this same kind of distance matrix based on sort of this pre-processing using the task-specific distance function. So once we have this distance matrix, what are we going to do with it? So I'll talk about a local approach, a global approach, and our approach which sort of combines aspects of global and local. Now, for visualization purposes here, assume each one of these boxes corresponds to one item being annotated. And we're going to assume that each item is going to be annotated by three people, 3 labelers. So we want to pick, again, for aggregation, the best label. So which one of these people gave the best label? And we're going to assume that it comes from the person here with the green face. And this green faced person, you can see things that they've also annotated in the past. They're labeling history. So for each item, we want to reason about the quality of, say, the green face label based on what they do on the current item, as well as the history of labels they've produced on other items in the data set. So the local approach, which we call smallest average distance, is really just looking for which label is most central. If you look at the distance between this label and all others, it has the smallest average distance. So this is an entirely local method. It doesn't pay any attention to the past history. And so, for instance, on this current item, we see that the green annotator is most central. And in history, he was maybe farthest away on every other one in the data set, but it doesn't matter because we don't look at history, we just look at the current item. This is a generalization of classic majority voting for small label spaces to these larger label spaces where we look at partial credit matching. Nice thing too to note is there's no training involved here. You don't even necessarily need to know annotator identities since it's just local to the particular item. So the global approach we call best average user is going to be the opposite. It's going to completely ignore the current item and just look in the past history, how accurate were our different annotators. So for the 3 annotators who labeled this item, which one had the best average accuracy in the past? Which one was most central in the past on everything else they labeled? So it could be on the current item, this person's very far away from everyone else, but on past items, they sort of were most central. And so we'll pick the label from them. So this is sort of the approach that uses past history, but ignores the current. Okay, so what we'd like now is to get the best of both worlds. So we want to have this notion of looking at history to sort of infer reliability weights for different annotators. But we also want this local context to see on the given item being annotated, sort of who is most central. And we want to build on this rich history of Bayesian models for simple annotations, but adapt it to these annotation distance matrices. So we build on multidimensional scaling. Our approach is called multidimensional annotation scaling, or MAS. And so whereas multidimensional scaling deals with a single distance matrix, we have here a different distance matrix for every different item that's being annotated. And we want to make a hierarchical Bayesian version of this, where we're going to have additional parameters like annotator reliability that are going to be shared across the different items or the different distance, the different different items being annotated. So as a Bayesian model, we're going to have 2 objectives for parameter estimation, our likelihood and our prior. So the likelihood comes straight out of classic multidimensional scaling. So we have this observed distance matrix for our items, and we want to come up with an embedding into a coordinate space such that the Euclidean distance between items in the coordinate space matches as closely as possible to the observed distances in our distance matrix. So we know that, for instance, we have these three captions for the image that all have small distances to one another, and they're all far from this one. So we want to induce an embedding into this other coordinate space where these three are all close together, whereas this other one is far apart. So that's what we want to get for our likelihood. Now, the new thing that makes our method different than multidimensional scaling is the prior. And so in the prior, we start with this assumption that at the origin, this is where our latent ground truth is that we want to find, our sort of pseudo gold label. And the model wants to penalize annotations that are far from the origin. So if you have a cluster of things that are all close together here, and one thing that's off by itself here, you'll pay a bigger penalty for having this cluster far from the origin than you would for having the single item far from the origin. So what we want to do then is therefore shift things such that we preserve the likelihood and the prior. So the likelihood, all of these things that are the relative distances we have from the observed matrix are preserved. We still have these three close together and this one far apart. And we sort of try to take care of this prior where we don't put things too far away from the origin, and particularly clusters of things get penalized more heavily than single things. Okay, so this is like majority voting in some sense so far. There isn't any notion of annotator reliability weights. So that's sort of the last piece to add in. So we have gamma corresponds to an error. And so you want to, have more attention or more consideration of the annotators who have a lower error rate. So in this case, we can see this annotator at the top has the lowest error of 0.1. And so we want to, how can I say this? The higher the annotation error is, the more you should want that to be farther from the origin, or the smaller it is, like this guy, the closer he should be to the origin. So what we want to do is bring this guy in closer to respect, to honor the low error rate he has in past data from what we've seen, while again, still respecting these other constraints. And so what we do there then is we sort of have this thing that becomes like weighted voting and acts like sort of these other hierarchical Bayesian models we have from the traditional crowdsourcing literature. Okay, so now I'll present results, and results are pretty short. It'll be probably just a couple of slides, and then we can get to any questions and answers. So we consider the same 4 data sets or 4 tasks that I showed earlier. So 2 of these are synthetic and 2 are real. So for the synthetic data set, we look at syntactic parsing, and there we grab like 3 or 4 different syntactic parsing models off the shelf and run them and treat them like annotators, basically. For ranked lists, we just generate some rankings of items. So these are, again, just sort of simulated synthetic data. And then we have 2 real data sets. So one real data set is looking at abstracts on PubMed and trying to figure out whether or not it corresponds to a randomized control trial, a study described in that medical study. And so the multi-annotations come from Mechanical Turk workers, and the gold standard comes from medical students. The other data set kindly shared by Chris Callison-Birch at UPenn is Urdu English translation. And so for all of these, there are sort of standard evaluation metrics, again, used to test how well models do versus a gold standard. And we can co-opt that same evaluation metric as a distance function for measuring the similarity between annotations. So baselines. So one thing you could have done was just had a single worker do the task and not bother with multiple annotators. So the random user baseline just randomly picks one as if only one person did the task. A weighted voting method from sort of the small label space is this one called ZenCrowd. It learns annotator weights based on how much they agree with other annotators. So what you'd expect is when exact match fails in a large label space, these weights will be kind of useless. So we don't expect it to work well because the label space is too large. In terms of sequence annotation, we take a custom bespoke probability model for doing aggregation on sequences. This is work of a past PhD student of mine, but I say we really heavily benchmarked it. If you go and read that paper from ACL, we have a lot of comparisons sort of showing that it's sort of a strong model. And then we have an upper bound oracle. So the oracle basically cheats and looks at the true gold standard. And so for each worker that comes, each answer or each label from different workers, it'll pick whichever one is closest to the gold standard. Note the oracle still doesn't get 100% because maybe none of the 5 workers who labeled an item, any of them got it right. So the oracle can only pick the best one of the 5 out of those. So results. So we have our 4 tasks, our 4 evaluation metrics. So we can see if we look at the random user, so this is just picking one person, we have a very big range across the 4 tasks, from translation being the hardest task versus the parsing being sort of the easiest task. All of these evaluation metrics go between 0 and 1. On the oracle, again, you can sort of see the oracle does better in some cases, greatly better than the random user. And so that's sort of the range that these methods are going to operate within in terms of space. So when you look at ZenCrowd versus random user, it's basically the same. And again, it's not because ZenCrowd isn't a great model, but the whole point is it learns annotator reliability weights based on how much annotators agree with one another. And in large label spaces, they never exactly agree with one another. And so basically it just doesn't work for learning those weights. In terms of this custom model for doing sequence annotation, you can see that does sort of much better than the random user. And then our results here for the multidimensional annotation scaling, our mass are, naturally better than the random user, less than the oracle. Good enough that I'm here giving a talk today about it. But I think the upshot, maybe it's on the next slide, but I'll just say it anyway, is our intuition is that if you're going to go and you want to collect data on some new task, you'd like to just have some general aggregation model that you can just apply to anything you're working on and not have to worry about coming up with something bespoke. If you really want to get the maximum accuracy, we expect you'll go make your own custom model and then get that extra little delta out. But why not start with a general thing first that just works for everything, and then only go that extra mile to come up with a custom one later if you need it? So our expectation was that this custom sequence model we had was going to sort of kick our butt. And it was remarkable that sort of this general model actually did as well on that task. That was actually, I think, the most surprising thing to us in this work. I mean, our intuition, I think, is still good that probably custom models ought to do better, but why not start with a general one first? So yeah, so this is the conclusion slide. So hundreds of papers on these aggregation models, but they typically just don't work at all, general models on these more complex tasks. And we want to enable, as AI models take on more and more complex tasks, we want to enable people to collect annotations and reason about them, aggregate them, with sort of a simple general model. So there's other bells and whistles I haven't talked about today, like semi-supervised learning or some different ways of sort of evaluating. But I think for the purpose of today, that's enough to wrap up. And so ongoing work here, we are looking at things like merging that I mentioned on the very first slide. We're looking at cases where you have different kinds of, well, what do we want to say? I think I'm just going to stop. So we're working on more things. We can say more if there's questions, or I'll just ask, or I can just answer questions about what we've actually did. So thanks.